Hello, everyone. So, obviously, I've talked about corruption in the Trump administration in other videos, but I wanted to just make a quick video, or not a quick video. I have a lot of stuff I want to cover, but I want to just make a video that's focusing on the corruption aspect, this whole drain the swamp promise that Trump did, and he ran on. That was part of the thing that he really ran on. So, like I said, I have a lot of articles that I'd like to get to, but before we do that, I want to address a few quick things. So, the Stormy Daniels scandal has been a little bit more fleshed out than it was previously. I kind of dismissed it as like a nothing story, and don't get me wrong, I think we should still be talking about other important issues, um, like climate change, ending the wars, universal health care, you name it. We need to still be talking about those things. And I think what happens is people more or less take the Stormy Daniels thing and Russiagate too, and it becomes kind of like a hot button issue. Like it's like reality TV, and I mean Trump's a reality TV star, and it's like, oh my God, scandalous. He's involved with this cover up involving a porn star. So let's talk about that, and it becomes kind of like an issue where people want to impeach Trump. This is specifically the Democrats, and it seems to me like that's what they focus on all the time, basically just trying to get Trump out of power. So I would say, first of all, I don't support Trump. First of all, um, I would like to see him go, but the problem is Pence is going to be even worse in my view. He's going to be basically everything that Trump is plus fundamentalist Christianity. He's going to be worse probably on social issues. I mean, it's not like things are great now, but I just feel like it's going to be even worse under him because he's kind of a smarter guy than Trump, and he's going to probably be more sneaky. More strategic in the way that he'll go after immigrants or gay people as like a couple examples. So I think devoting that time into trying to impeach Trump, the other problem is that you lose all of that political capital. I mean, because Pence is going to be so much harder to run against in a 2020 race. In my view, I mean, Trump's such a huge failure at this point. So, I mean, it's just a much easier run. And it's almost to the point where anyone could run against Trump in 2020 and they would win. So, I think it's just going to make everything harder to try and impeach Trump, and you waste that time when you could be talking about other issues. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but I think they hyper focus on these other things as a kind of as an excuse to not talk about the important issues. Um, so the Stormy Daniels thing has been fleshed out a lot more. My lights keep flickering. um, and Rudy Giuliani is now on the Trump legal team, and I, I I have to assume he's regretting that decision because Rudy Giuliani just keeps screwing up. He's going on national television, and it's not even that he's making an ass of himself. He's basically just you don't know what his angle is when he says the things he's trying to say. It's just as baffling. I mean, previously, Rudy Giuliani like exposed the kind of secret behind the Muslim ban and said Trump called him up and said like, how do I make the Muslim ban legal? And what that shows is like the whole scandal with that was it's like, oh, I'm not really trying to ban an entire religion, but yeah, you kind of were actually because you were just looking for ways to skirt the law and try and do that. And I mean, the first version of the ban was struck down. The first version was so blatantly unconstitutional, and I assume probably the second one is if you really want to dissect it. But the first one, it was a ban of all people in a list of countries, 6 countries, that were all Muslim majority countries, and then it says like, oh yeah, but we're going to give an exception to Christians, basically, to religious minorities. So everyone who's a Muslim is going to get included in the ban because they're not a minority in all these countries. So it's like you're de facto banning all Muslims in those countries. We'll say, but it's just what he's doing now. Rudy Giuliani, when it comes to Stormy Daniels, is he was on Fox News and he contradicted what Trump said, because Trump said, I mean, his story has like shifted so much now at this point. But what we know is that Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, paid off Stormy Daniels to keep quiet about their affair during the election, and Trump later reimbursed that amount, $130,000 to Michael Cohen. And Rudy Giuliani was basically saying like that's perfectly legal, and it's like, well, like even if that's the case, it doesn't exactly come off as a really ethical or presidential thing, and I don't particularly care about appearance, as many of you probably know, but it certainly says something that you're gonna pay someone off to keep quiet, and it's like you claim this thing never happened. Basically, Trump did. And there was, a contract, there was an NDA that Stormy Daniels signed that said, like, even, like, video or pictures of this thing that totally didn't happen, she had to sign that she would keep quiet about. So obviously she's spoken out about that now. And the other thing with Giuliani is, so he tried to make it seem like Trump was hurt by this scandal for these allegations for personal reasons, basically tension between him and Melania, that they would get a divorce. So it's like, oh gosh, really? And it wasn't political. But then in the same interview, like literally a minute later, Giuliani says, well, what would have happened if this had gotten out during the election in October of 2016, right before the election? Like, well, which one is it? Was it political or was it personal? And I think clearly what happened was they saw that scandal as, if it came out, it would probably hurt Trump pretty badly. So they dealt with it. And it wasn't campaign money, they say, so that's why it was legal. It was Trump's own money. But, I think we have to kind of wait and see at this point. It might still have violated the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission's rules. And if so, then Trump might be liable for that. But we'll have to wait and see what happens with that, I guess. Fox News host Neil Cavuto, who's, a fairly mediocre host, I would say, he's called out Trump for being a liar with the Stormy Daniels thing and other things. He basically said, like, like, this is your swamp, like all the scandals that are happening now in his administration, and he's not dealing with it. So I think it just says something that you do have people on Fox News now that are basically speaking out in a way that wasn't really imaginable before, like speaking out against a Republican president. It shows that something is kind of shifting. He's losing support. Trump announced on National Prayer Day that he's created a new faith initiative to have religious leaders advising politicians throughout the federal government. And, so this is perhaps due to some nepotism. I mean, he's had, actually a number of spiritual advisors before he made this announcement, which I think is very disturbing, the fact that you have spiritual advisors to the president. Because look, we have a separation of church and state in this country. It's in the Constitution in kind of numerous places. So obviously, the First Amendment, you have freedom of religion, which means you don't establish a religion in government. But that's not necessarily individual for Trump. I think we've kind of crossed that boundary before Trump, but Trump is just making it worse, in my view. It's becoming the line between church and state is much more foggy now under Trump. Um, and it's obvious, like we're a majority Christian country, and we just don't try to be secular at all about it. There's you name it, like during the inauguration, like all this talk about God and praying and all this stuff. Like, we're supposed to be a secular nation, so I mean, maybe it's something small, but I think Trump more or less is doing this to gain support. I think he's losing support, um, and that's why he's scared. The other reason why it was unconstitutional, I wanted to say, is there's no religious tests in the Constitution. It says to be in office, there should be no religious tests. And part of this initiative is you have these advisors, and they're going to tell people in the federal government when they're breaching biblical law, essentially. So that's their gonna. So is that their concern, that they're breaching biblical law when they do something? Because that would kind of be a religious test. Yeah, I would say so. Okay, so let's jump into the articles. I have a lot I want to get to. So Trump seeks immunity over foreign business payments. This is from Reuters. President Donald Trump has again asked a U.S. court to dismiss a suit accusing him of flouting constitutional safeguards against corruption by refusing to separate himself from his business empire while in office, claiming absolute immunity. The lawsuit, filed by the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia, accused Trump of violating the U.S. Constitution's Emoluments Clause that bars U.S. officials from accepting gifts or other payments from foreign governments without congressional approval. The same clause also bars the president from receiving gifts and payments from individual states. If plaintiffs want to sue the president for acts taken while in office, they must sue him in official capacity, but he's absolutely immune from any lawsuit, including this one, seeking to impose individual liability premised on his assumption of the presidency itself. Trump's lawyer, William Consovoy, wrote in a court filing on Tuesday. So I just want to pause real quick. The Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, it's a way to try to keep foreign governments disentangled from our officials, because it's like a you scratch your I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of situation. Quid pro quo would be the appropriate phrase, I would say. And there's examples of this. Look, with Saudi Arabia, Trump registered 8 new businesses during the campaign in Saudi Arabia. And there's all this talk that like he's not involved in the business decisions anymore. Like his children do that, but I mean he's still profiting off it. So I mean, I think that should be what really matters. I mean, not whether he's doing the decision making. If he did zero decision making with his businesses, but if he's profiting off his businesses, and there's businesses of his all over the world, then yeah, I would say that should be a violation of the Constitution. And Saudi Arabia, when the kings and all that they came to Washington, they stayed in one of Trump's hotels and paid $270,000. And that's likely not because the cost of the room was $270,000. That they live very lavish lives, I understand that, but that is probably a bribe, and I feel like proving that probably wouldn't be very hard to actually look into the finer details of it. But I mean, regardless if there was any kind of quid pro quo going on there, they're paying Trump a gift. It's $270,000. That's not a gift. I don't know what is. And we did give Saudi Arabia like $100 billion weapons deal, whatever the amount was. It was, and that's not necessarily unique to Trump. We've had a relationship with Saudi Arabia for a long time, but it goes back to Trump basically saying like he's gonna like drain the swamp and shake up the status quo, change the way Washington is run, and he's not done that. I mean, so that's just the truth. If you think that Trump is changing the way we do things, that's not true. And the ways that he is, you could argue, are just probably making it worse. It's like making things more corrupt. And it's not necessarily new. I would say it's more just kind of going back to Reagan and that kind of blatant corruption that was going on then. So I just want to read a little bit more of this article. Trump's lawyer continues, the Supreme Court has concluded that the cost to the nation of allowing such suits to distract the president from his official duties outweigh any countervailing interests. That choice must be respected. And I found that really funny because, first of all, I don't know if what he's saying is true about the Supreme Court. If it is, I would just say the Supreme Court is wrong because that's ridiculous. Because then you could never look into presidential corruption at all. The fact is, you're saying, oh, he can't be involved in this lawsuit because it's going to distract him from his duties as president. Well, how about no? How about he does his job as president and you be transparent? That's apparently that's hard for Trump, and I wonder why. So let's jump to the Hill and Sean Hannity. First of all, let's set the stage here. Sean Hannity, it turned out, was a client of Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, and it was some big secret, this secret third client, and Sean Hannity never disclosed this. Despite being like probably the biggest Trump supporter on Fox News, which is saying a lot. And he later claimed once it came out, like, oh, it was very minor. Like he talked to me about real estate things. So it turns out Hannity is involved with this real estate company that received federal money. So let's read from the Hill here. Fox News host Sean Hannity is linked to a group of shell companies that have spent $90 million buying hundreds of homes across the U.S. through the help of foreclosures in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. More than 870 homes in 7 different states have been purchased over the past decade, ranging from large mansions to rentals for low-income families, according to The Guardian. For some of the mortgages, Hannity reportedly obtained funding from HUD under the National Housing Act loan program, which was first guaranteed under the Obama administration. So that's already kind of interesting. He's obtaining money from HUD, a government agency, under this program that started under Obama. Sounds vaguely like Hannity's kind of being a welfare queen, if you ask me. And as it turns out, says here, HUD recently increased Hannity's original $17.9 million mortgage for purchases in Georgia by an additional $5 million, records obtained by The Guardian show. Hannity did not disclose his cooperation with the department when he had HUD Secretary Ben Carson on his show last June, The Guardian noted. During that segment, Hannity railed against the state of public housing and praised Carson, telling him, "You've done a good job." So, here's Ben Carson coming in here, giving, extra money to an already rich person, a millionaire. And it's federal money, and it's a loan, so I'm assuming, he's going to pay it back or whatever. But, this shows nepotism. Nepotism is essentially a form of corruption in and of itself, because what's going on there is you have mutual friends that are going to, cut you a deal that you wouldn't have unless you had people in the government. And that's the thing, is like, if you had something similar like this going on with Hillary, if you had something like she was involved in a company that later got federal money, you would see crazy stories about it on Fox News, and to be honest, I wouldn't agree with that either if Hillary was doing something like that. But I want consistency, and you're not going to see that in the mainstream right or left. Is the point I'm saying? There's too much polarization in the worst ways. Because obviously I'm against the right in a lot of ways, but I'm against them for principled reasons. They just have this kind of team red, team blue mentality, and studies have shown that's actually the way it is for a lot of Americans. They just have that kind of mentality. Um, so yes, and also this idea that big government is bad, except Sean Hannity is using the government to his advantage in this case. Kind of ridiculous. So let's go back to Reuters. The EPA granted a waiver to a former Trump advisor that could save his oil company millions of dollars by skirting pollution regulations. And so let's read from that. My lights are just not happy today. I'm sorry, it's loading. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has granted a financial hardship waiver to an oil refinery owned by billionaire Carl Icahn, a former advisor to President Donald Trump, exempting the Oklahoma facility from requirements under a federal biofuels law, according to two industry sources briefed on the matter. The waiver enables Icahn's CVR Energy Inc. to avoid tens of millions of dollars in costs related to the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard RFS program. The regulation is meant to cut air pollution, reduce petroleum imports, and support corn farmers by requiring refiners to mix billions of gallons of biofuels into the nation's gasoline and diesel each year. The Small Refiners Coalition, which represents companies that operate small refining facilities, said that the EPA is required by law to help small refineries struggling with these regulations and that such exemptions are crucial to their financial well-being. It applauded EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt for protecting small refineries, regardless of ownership from the RFS requirements. But the exemption for CVR's Winewood, Oklahoma plant prompted criticism from a corn state lawmaker and the powerful corn lobby, which has already accused Trump's EPA of overusing the hardship waiver program in a way that hurts demand for ethanol. Hundreds of millions, and in some cases billions of dollars in profits isn't my definition of hardship. Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley said in a statement condemning the CVR waiver. President Trump promised to support homegrown biofuels, and Administrator Pruitt is breaking that promise. So let's just stop there. Chuck Grassley is against this, and Chuck Grassley is one of the most conservative people in the Senate. So that goes to show you just how crazy this is. And again, it's nepotism all day long here. This is someone that was a Trump advisor, and he's getting a waiver under Trump's EPA where he's going to save tens of millions of dollars by cutting they don't have to follow regulations. And I don't even know, it's ridiculous that would even be allowed. I mean, for a truly small refinery, I guess so, yeah. I don't even know what a small refinery would look like, but I can guess it's not going to cost tens of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, like Grassley is saying. So, again, it's these connections between government and private industry that are very disheartening, and it's obviously used for personal gain, and that's the problem. So I want to go quick to The Economist because they had a piece about Scott Pruitt, and to be honest, I don't think he's going to be in the EPA much longer. I feel like he's probably going to resign soon because there's just so much stuff going around. It almost seems as if he just wanted to try and get away with as much stuff as possible before resigning. So I just want to read a little bit of this here. He spent lots of taxpayer cash on first class airline tickets, tripled the size of his security detail, which accompanied him on a holiday to Disneyland, and installed a soundproof phone booth in his office, costing $43,000, which the Government Accountability Office says violated federal spending laws. Like, imagine that. Like, you're installing a soundproof phone booth in your office. Gee, I wonder what that's for. And it cost $43,000, and the Government Accountability Office says that that's against federal spending laws. At one point, Mr. Pruitt reportedly tried using his motorcade's flashing lights and sirens to expedite a trip to dinner at La Diplomate, a once trendy French restaurant in Washington. That seems like an odd thing to be to speak out against, but whatever. There are at least 6 current investigations into his conduct, and 4 Republican congressmen have called for his resignation. Given all that, it is easy to overlook what Mr. Pruitt is actually doing at the helm of the EPA. On April 24th, he unveiled a new policy which would prohibit the agency from using studies backed by confidential data, like medical records, when drafting environmental regulations. He has removed scientists affiliated with universities from the department's scientific advisory committees. Staff morale is plunged. This is the culmination of a decades-long campaign against the secret science underpinning environmental regulation. In 1993, researchers at Harvard published the 6 Cities study, which definitively linked air quality to premature death using confidential medical records from 8,000 people. The study prompted the first regulations on fine particulate matter issued under the Clean Air Act in 1997. Manufacturers spent millions in an effort to dispute the science and called for the release of the raw data, which researchers bound by a confidentiality agreement, refused. Today, the findings are established science, and the rules they inspired will prevent more than 230,000 deaths, early deaths, by 2020. So clearly, there's a movement led by Scott Pruitt in the EPA, probably with others, his cronies that are in there, that he's put in there, to block out scientists. And he's said, as I've said in other videos, that he's basically just going to the oil industry now, and that's who he talks to do his job. Which makes no sense, because it'd be like cops talking to robbers to figure out how to do their job. Like, you can't be buddy-buddy with the people that you're trying to enforce. That is not appropriate. It doesn't even... It wouldn't make sense to a child. And yet, this is what we're dealing with in the age of Trump. So let's go to Vice on the Afghanistan situation. And it says, once it loads, Trump's military buildup in Afghanistan really isn't stopping the Taliban. Trump's ramped up military efforts in Afghanistan have failed to rein in the Taliban, according to a new report which shows the insurgents' grip on the country growing ever stronger. The Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR for short, released Tuesday, makes for gloomy reading as the conflict approaches its 17th year, undercutting the U.S. military's more optimistic spin in recent months. Specifically, the report shows the Taliban and other militant groups now control or influence 59 of Afghanistan's 407 districts, or 14.5%, the highest level since SIGAR began receiving district-level breakdown data in late 2015. Those numbers are made worse by another trend. The size of the Afghan security forces dropped by about 10% over the past year as morale collapsed under increased insurgent attacks, desertions, and government corruption. Since January 2017, the number of Afghan National Police officers fell by more than 23,200, while the number of Afghan National Army troops fell by nearly 5,000. So SIGAR, the head of that, later he says that building up the Afghan forces is a top priority for the U.S. Afghanistan's defense ministry disputed the report's findings. saying, we have enough soldiers, everything is fine. But then, turns out, when you read on here, it says the report arrived as the Afghan capital, Kabul, was still recovering from another string of deadly terror attacks on Monday. An ISIS double-tap suicide attack killed at least 26 people, including 9 journalists. A bombing the week before killed 60 people. The constant barrage of attacks comes as Trump's team pushes for a military solution in the war-ravaged country. Since taking office, Trump has pushed for an aggressive role in Afghanistan, sending in thousands of new troops and giving commanders broader authority to order airstrikes. In November, General John Nicholson, the U.S.'s top general in Afghanistan, claimed the strategy was working and that the situation had turned the corner. So, okay. Let me point out the obvious, or I think what should be obvious. Why are we in Afghanistan at all anymore? Because the whole point we were there in the first place was to kill Osama bin Laden. Mission accomplished. Okay, we killed him a long time ago. A couple years ago. And then, okay, yeah, we want to go after Al Qaeda because they were behind 9/11. We decimated Al Qaeda in Afghanistan to virtually nothing. They have less than 100 members in Afghanistan. Great. So then why are we there? Well, we're going to go after the Taliban now because they aided Al Qaeda in the country. Well, why? Did the Taliban attack us in any way? No, they didn't attack us on our soil. They've issued attacks against the West, but they have no means of getting here. How is this even possible? I mean, you hear so many conspiracies on the right about this, about how ISIS is going to come up through the border. That's why we need to have strong border security because the terrorists are going to come across the border. Like how? How is ISIS, people that speak Arabic, they're Muslim, they're gonna somehow communicate with people in Mexico that are Catholic mostly and speak Spanish? Like how does that happen? Because they're not just gonna come to the country, it could come to Mexico and know exactly how to cross the border. No. So I'm going off a little bit, but the point is, the Taliban, they're more or less nationalistic. They want to have broader control of Afghanistan, and they've issued attacks against the West. I understand, but our continued presence there is only going to agitate them more. And they say the lesson of Vietnam is you can't fight a guerrilla army in their own territory. And at this point, I mean, they're kind of like they control more than we have seen them in the past. At least that we're recording, and making data for. So, at what point do we decide, oh, this battle has gone on too long and we're not going to be able to win this? I don't know. But I think at some point it's going to have to occur to people that it's not in our best interest to be in Afghanistan. And ISIS is in Afghanistan, yes, we know. But they've been decimated to practically nothing. I mean, this is just the truth. And they have no means of getting here. So I think this notion that if we withdraw from the Middle East, there's going to be a terror attack here. Well, I don't necessarily think so. And secondly, you're going to create more terrorism by killing more civilians, which I've said countless times, of course. So now we go to John Bolton. Gosh, I have a lot. I'm out of breath. I have a lot to say here, and it's not good news, any of it. John Bolton, when discussing North Korea negotiations, said we should use the Libya model. Doesn't that sound grand? And this is his quote. This is from the Daily Beast. We have very much in mind the Libya model from 2003 and 2004, Bolton said on Fox News Sunday, referring to the African country's decision to get rid of its nuclear weapons after negotiating with American officials. 7 years later, Libya found itself in a civil war that led to the death of its dictator, Muammar. I don't know how to say that. Muammar Gaddafi, after an intervention by the U.S. and its allies. It's unclear how John Bolton's message will be received by Kim Jong-un's regime, which has already taken some steps, though none of them concrete or verifiable, toward denuclearization. Pyongyang has long cited U.S. interventions in countries such as Libya as reasons why it needs nuclear weapons. So, John Bolton saying that is undermining the talks of peace going on and denuclearization. And people are already jumping the gun and saying Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, for doing this, when nothing concrete has happened yet. Nothing has been agreed upon yet. Kim Jong-un says it has nothing to do with Trump, and I mean, he could be lying about that, fair enough. But what did Trump, what did he do, actually? He just was a Twitter troll, basically, and a bully, and did some sanctions, I guess. Well, I don't know. He didn't do anything different except for being an ass on Twitter. And this all just came out of nowhere. So I really don't think it didn't seem like this was a reaction to Trump saying the stuff he did. It seems like there's probably a lot more going on than we realize. But the point with John Bolton is he's saying we're looking at Libya. Well, that should signal, or it might signal to Kim Jong-un you're trying to overthrow him. And then he might have second thoughts about denuclearization, or maybe to the degree at which that'll happen. Because once you sit down for the negotiations, it's going to come down to does North Korea denuclearize altogether? Do they have, or do they keep like short-range nuclear missiles so that they might strike South Korea? These are questions that are going to be asked, and it makes it much more complicated that John Bolton is basically hinting at possibly overthrowing him, because that's, I mean, what is the Libya model if not for that? Because the point that he's saying, John Bolton, he later goes on and says, like, we were able to go in there in Libya and see for ourselves, and we didn't have to rely on international mechanisms. But this is like the Iran deal, where it's like you just don't trust the institutions that we have in place, like the IAEA that goes in there and verifies these things. It's like we have to be the ones unilaterally to make the claim, oh yeah, now it's okay. Now there's no nuclear weapons. Well, I just feel like a statement like this is making it less likely for peace, because you're basically, like I just said, signaling to Kim Jong-un that we may not be very trustworthy. So Marco Rubio went off script, according to CNN, on the GOP tax plan, and this is his quote. There's still a lot of thinking on the right that if big corporations are happy, they're going to take the money they're saving and reinvest it in American workers, Rubio told The Economist last week in comments that were picked up by the Washington Post on Monday. In fact, they bought back shares. A few gave out bonuses. There's no evidence whatsoever that the money's been massively poured back into the American worker. And, I mean, he's right. I mean, I've talked about before, there was a some kind of press conference going on with the Wall Street Journal and Gary Cohn back when he was still in the administration, and they asked people in the room, they were all like Wall Street guys, who's going to take the money that they save from the tax plan and reinvest it in capital, basically reinvest it in their own companies that will be, it'll hire the wages of the workers because you're reinvesting that money. And very few people raise their hands. They're taking the money and running. That's now their own personal money, basically. So it's trickle-down economics, and I've talked about it numerous times, but I'll just go over it briefly. Deregulation, cutting taxes for the rich, and this whole idea that like the rich are they're gonna just out of the virtue of their hearts, give it back to the workers. But that is not shown to be the case. And what happens is you have more income inequality. The middle class it shrinks, and it shrinks in the wrong direction. More people are poor. They don't have money to spend in the economy, and then the economy crashes. It's a boom-bust cycle. So basically as simple as that. So I just wanted to touch on that again. Lastly, I want to talk about Mick Mulvaney. And this really gets to the heart, I think, of Drain the Swamp and why it's a lie. What he says here. Mick Mulvaney, interim head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, told banking executives Tuesday that as a South Carolina congressman, he always met with constituents. But he never met with out-of-town lobbyists, he said, unless they gave him campaign money, explaining why the bankers should push their agenda on Capitol Hill. We had a hierarchy in my office in Congress, said Mulvaney, who was a leading conservative in the House until President Trump tapped him to be the White House budget director, a job he still holds. If you were a lobbyist who never gave us money, I didn't talk to you. If you were a lobbyist who gave us money, I might talk to you. Okay, let's pause for a second. If you were a lobbyist who never gave us money, so in other words, I have to. It's pay to play, isn't that kind of what it is? You're already having a transaction involved there, where I have to pay you to try and, if I'm a lobbyist, let's say I'm a lobbyist for the environment, or maybe I'm a lobbyist to try and get universal health care. But like I have to pay him in order to talk to him, and then he might not even talk to me. And I bet he's not going to talk to me if I was a lobbyist for those things, because he doesn't agree with those things. He's going to do the things that he agrees with. So his mind's already made up. I mean, the money is one of the deciding factors, and also if it fits within his ideology. And he said, like, I talked to constituents, regardless if you came from back home and sat in my lobby, I talked to you. And he said this to a bunch of bankers. So, I mean, first of all, is that even true? How do we verify that? I don't know. And so, these comments, the article goes on to say, this is from the Washington Post, by the way, it drew the ire from Democrats, backlash. Let me just read kind of what they wrote real quick. Nothing says drain the swamp like telling a room full of bankers to give more money to politicians who put the interests of banks ahead of people. Representative Adam B. Schiff, Democrat of California, said. Senator Bob Casey, Democrat from Pennsylvania, my state, tweeted, "This is supposed to be a government by the people, for the people, not a government of the thieves and the money changers. Mick Mulvaney is a disgrace." Yeah, so let me just talk on this real quick. Like, I think it's right to go after Mick Mulvaney, of course, but I think at the same time, we shouldn't pretend like the Democrats are kind of, above this kind of behavior, because I don't think they are, really. They take corporate money, especially when you're talking about some of the bigger names. I mean, Chuck Schumer has taken millions of dollars from the healthcare industries, I know, as one example. Nancy Pelosi brags about being a master legislator, which basically, if you read her comments, she's just talking about raising money. She knows how to raise money. And they side with Republicans when it comes to deregulating, Wall Street all the time. Well, not all the Democrats, but there's a number of them that do it. And a lot of times, it comes down to only a few votes that are on the Democratic side. So they have to get their ducks in a row here, the Democrats. They have to be a unified party and say, no, we want economic populism, because the neoliberalism, the third way, compromises, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in a 2020 election, and it may not even work in the midterms. I mean, we have to wait and see, but I feel like they are too lenient, and not willing to be progressive enough, and it's going to hurt them. I mean, look, there was a new poll that came out that said millennials, their the Democratic support is losing millennial support. So that shows that the midterms are not necessarily in a good spot right now for them. And also, this is from The Intercept. I just want to read real quick. This is kind of a breakdown of a few kind of leading contenders for 2020, and it shows how these people have basically all sworn off corporate PAC money. But Zaid Jalani, I believe it is, yeah, of The Intercept, he writes how they're still getting large individual donors, the money from large individual donors. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not beholden to, basically the 1%. People that may not have the best interests of the American people. So Cory Booker, 10.37% of Booker's campaign funding has come from PACs, 76.4% of which is from business PACs. By contrast, 72.12% of Booker's campaign funding is from large individual donors. Maria Cantwell, just 0.62% of Cantwell's campaign funding has come from PACs of any kind. In contrast, 73.61% of her campaign funding has come from large donors. Kirsten Gillibrand, 6.95% of Gillibrand's campaign funding has come from PACs. Of this proportion, 65.73% is from business PACs. Meanwhile, 62.15% of her fundraising has come from large individual donors. Kamala Harris, 4.89% is from PACs. 41.07% is from business PACs. By contrast, 64.99% of her campaign funding has come from large donors. And Bernie Sanders, 1.73% of Sanders' funding has come from PACs. Of that, 7.27% is from business PACs. 17.7% of his funding has come from large individual contributors. Elizabeth Warren, just 1.4% of Warren's campaign money has come from PACs. Of that, 12.91% is from business PACs. Large individual donors made up 29.72% of her campaign funding. So that's a lot of numbers, I understand, but what it comes down to is they're going to say I don't take corporate PAC money, but I think we have to read in between the lines and see where the money is really coming from, because if it's still coming from large donors, and they define large donors as people who give $200 or more. So I mean, it could still be bigger contributions of thousands of dollars. So I think we just have to really look at who the biggest contributors are and what their stake in the game is. What are they for? Because that's gonna probably have a lot to say about what the candidate is gonna do, and we don't know who the candidate is gonna be in 2020. But just be wary of that, because they say Kamala Harris has basically come out for all the progressive positions, but the voting record is really what it's gonna come down to. So don't just listen to talk. You have to look at what they're doing behind the scenes. Is basically the point I'm making. But let me just go back to the Mick Mulvaney thing, because they talk about what he has been doing in the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was started by Elizabeth Warren. And he's basically decimated this thing, which is a kind of bureaucracy that's actually really good. Mulvaney's leadership of the CFPB has repeatedly drawn the ire of Democrats who worry that he is weakening the consumer watchdog agency. Mulvaney has launched a top-to-bottom review of the agency, stripped enforcement powers from a CFPB unit responsible for pursuing discrimination cases, and proposed that lawmakers curb the agency's powers. In his speech Tuesday, Mulvaney also took aim at the agency's complaint database, which thousands of consumers use each year to file complaints about debt collection practices, mortgages, credit cards, and other matters. Republicans and the financial industry say that the database is full of errors and unverified complaints, Democrats and supporters of the agency say it's essential to the CFPB's operations. But Mulvaney indicated that he may stop making the entire database publicly available. I don't see anything in here that I have to run a Yelp for financial services sponsored by the federal government. I don't see anything in here that says I have to make all of those public. Um, well, this idea like, okay, there's unverified claims. Well, it's your job to verify it. It's your job to do the investigative work to see that it's real. So if people see a complaint online, I mean, you have to know what you're reading. You have to know that it's a complaint, and it may not necessarily be real, but I think it's just basically a matter of making things easier for these bigger corporations, credit card people that have practices that are not good. Like they charge people for things that they don't even get. Um, and that's not good. We need something in place that's going to stand up for the consumer when there's corporations out there that have practices that are just shady. Let's just be real. So, in conclusion, with all this, Trump is not draining the swamp. He is making it far worse, in my view. He's. I just don't even know where to really begin. I just ranted about that for like practically an hour now, but point being, this idea that he was going to change things in Washington is not true because it has not panned out. Um, if anything, we're going in reverse. We're going, back to historically what we know is not true. Trickle down economics, and basically you're mixing private business with government in a way that's probably it would go back to Reagan if anybody probably, but I would say it's just like this blatant corruption, which we've never really seen before, which I think may be almost a good thing in the sense that like it's like so blatant now with Trump that like we can just spot it like that, and people are smart and they read stuff on the internet. I think people on the left are pretty well versed and they know BS when they see it. So there's that aspect of it that you can spot it easily, but it it puts our country in a bad spot to basically have to we still have to solve so many problems, and people that don't have health care as one example. I mean, and the issues aren't getting addressed, and that's like the real tragedy is that we're just at a standstill. We're dealing with the same old corruption, and it's probably worse than the same old corruption. Meanwhile, the middle class suffers the consequences.